It looks like we have about half the people on the call. The others will trickle in as we go along. This month on NWGA's webinar, we have Hayden Ord with BC Ministry of Energy, Mines and Low Carbon Initiative. And he is going to talk to us about the BC hydrogen strategy and their plan to roll that out. Before I turn it over to Hayden, I would like to remind you guys that you're going to be muted during the time. This is being recorded and will be put on the YouTube channel later today. And Hayden will make his presentation available, so you will get a note from me letting you know that the webinar is posted and it will have the slides attached. Use the chat feature to ask questions. Hayden would like to answer those at the end of the presentation, and we'll be keeping an eye on that. And we have 2 other upcoming webinars we want you to know about. This month, AGA rolled out their net zero emission opportunities for gas utilities, and they're going to speak with us next month on March 17th about those. And then in April, we have energy policy and housing affordability, Mark Long and Greg Lane will both join us and talk about housing affordability in context of all these gas ban bills that are going on and other energy proposals we're seeing. Those are both available on the website on the webinar tab, and you can register for those. And with that, I'll hand it over to you, Hayden, if you want to go ahead and share your screen.
Great, thank you, Judy.
You're very welcome.
All right, let me know when it comes up there for you.
We got it.
Great. Okay, well, thank you very much, Judy, for the introduction. It sounds like you have a couple of exciting webinars coming up over the next couple months. I also want to thank Jennifer Davison from my ministry, who I think is a regular listener of these webinars and kind of made the introduction for me to come talk today.
Yes, we appreciate that.
Yeah, as Judy said, I'm Hayden Ord. I'm a senior policy analyst with the Energy and Industry Decarbonization branch in the BC Ministry of Energy, Mines and Low Carbon Innovation. Our branch does lots of exciting work. We, of course, work on hydrogen and then other things like bioenergy and carbon capture, utilization, and storage. So all of those fit together really nicely, but especially with everything happening around hydrogen today, and given the release of our BC hydrogen strategy, we're primarily focusing on hydrogen right now. So there we go, get over to the first slide. For today, wanted to cover kind of 4 main pieces. The first one could be far too elementary for some of the folks on the call here, but I really like to do it to make sure that everyone gets up to the same speed and we can all understand what we're talking about and have a good discussion moving forward, especially in the question and answers. So going over what is hydrogen, how do we use it, and why is it important now? Then I'll do an overview of the BC hydrogen strategy, touch on a hydrogen blending study that we're working on, and then also dive into the implementation of the hydrogen strategy. So what is hydrogen and how is it used? Hydrogen is actually the most abundant element in our universe. About 75% of it is made up of hydrogen atoms. And if you put 2 hydrogen atoms together, you get hydrogen gas, which is very energy rich. You can combine hydrogen with oxygen in a fuel cell to produce electricity, or you can combust it to produce heat. And the exciting part about those 2 different options there is that they don't produce any carbon emissions at all. So that means that hydrogen can be used to decarbonize a wide variety of applications that in most cases aren't practical to decarbonize via, say, direct electrification or other means. And why hydrogen now? Which is a really important question, I think, for many of us, both on the utilities side and also government and private sector, to ask ourselves, because there have been previous hype cycles. In the 80s and 90s, hydrogen was really seen as kind of a means to an end with fuel cell development. Of course, you need the fuel for said fuel cells. In the early 2000s, hydrogen was seen as a pathway to overcome limitations for electric vehicles, so very transportation focused. And today, while transportation is still definitely an application of hydrogen, it really provides a flexible tool for many sectors. So touched on it a little bit in the earlier slide, but that means that we can use hydrogen to decarbonize transportation as well as industry, blending into the natural gas network, and then also home heating, things like that. And while it provides a flexible tool, we also really need it. If you look over on the right there of this slide where there's the energy demand for BC, almost 70% of BC's energy demand is still met through fossil fuels. And that's even given we have abundant hydroelectricity here. So that's where you need to consider alternative options for decarbonization. And while as a government, we're not going to put a peg in how much or how little of a role hydrogen is going to play in decarbonizing our economy, it is becoming increasingly clear that hydrogen is going to be here in the future and play an important role. So the BC Hydrogen Strategy was released in July 2021. Still feels like yesterday, I think, for myself and a lot of the folks on my team, but time flies. Is a Clean BC commitment, and Clean BC is British Columbia's basically climate action plan, and hydrogen is just one of many components within that. The BC Hydrogen Strategy clarifies how BC will promote, incentivize, and support the development of hydrogen production, use, and export over the next 10 years and beyond. And that's broken down through 63 policy actions in the short, medium, and long term. The great thing for us in developing a BC hydrogen strategy is that we certainly aren't starting from scratch. BC is already recognized as a world leader in fuel cell and hydrogen technology. And that's exemplified in actually having over half of Canada's hydrogen companies located within the province, so about 70 companies. And while having that kind of hydrogen cluster here has been important, a lot of their technology has been exported out of BC, and that's enabled kind of the global hydrogen industry to grow. But one thing we acknowledge in the strategy is that we have an opportunity to deploy that technology here within BC and within North America. So that a big part of it is local deployment of BC technology. This graphic here is borrowed from our friend Matthew Klippenstein at Hydrogen BC and the Canadian Hydrogen and Fuel Cell Association. And it shows heavy duty vehicles using Canadian hydrogen technology. And while this is a Canadian flag in the back, as I mentioned, over half of Canada's hydrogen companies are located in BC. So this really could be a BC flag. But as you can see, there's a clear hockey stick effect occurring where in 2021, the number of vehicles absolutely dwarfs the number in 2017. So we're really seeing the growth in the hydrogen sector. Something else that's been really helpful for us when we're implementing the BC hydrogen strategy is that BC as a province already has a lot of existing new and improved supportive policies for hydrogen. So we have our BC carbon tax, which is going up to $50 per ton in just a couple of months and will increase to $170 per ton in 2030. There's the BC low carbon fuel standard, which is basically requiring a 30% reduction in the carbon intensity of supplied fuel for transport applications by 2030. There's also in a recent update of the Clean BC plan called the Clean BC Roadmap to 2030. This was introduced, but also kind of the consideration of how do we expand the BC low carbon fuel standard beyond just transportation, because the standard has actually been the province's most effective tool for reducing emissions. So just imagine what can happen there if that goes beyond the transportation sector. We also have the BC zero emission vehicle mandate, and that's right now just for light duty vehicles. So 100% of new light duty vehicles will be required to be zero emission by 2035. There's also an interest in expanding that to heavy duty vehicles, medium and heavy duty vehicles. We also have the Clean BC Clean Industry and Innovation Rate, which is a discounted electricity rate to encourage the production of clean fuels using BC's clean electricity. And I think for now, where that sits at is about 7 years, and it starts off with a 20% discount and then gets tapered down across the schedule. There's also a new greenhouse gas reduction standard, which establishes an emission caps for natural gas utilities in 2030. And the important piece with this is that previously there was a requirement to have at least 15% of your supplied fuel be renewable natural gas. But where government and utilities in BC are getting creative here is acknowledging that sourcing that renewable natural gas has been harder than expected. So what this new GHG reduction standard does is says, okay, we acknowledge that, but now how do we get the equivalent amount of emission reductions from other activities or from other fuels being blended in, say like hydrogen, that allows us to achieve the equivalent emission reduction. So definitely not backing down from trying to achieve those really ambitious targets. Enabler within that is the greenhouse gas reduction regulation, and that allows utilities to reduce emissions by acquiring renewable gases. So recently that was amended to include green hydrogen as well as byproduct hydrogen. And another piece of kind of guiding policy that's been interesting to see spur some hydrogen development is a target within Clean BC to have 80% reduction in diesel consumption in remote communities by 2030. There's about 50 communities within BC that actually aren't connected to either our electricity grid or the natural gas network. And that means that in most cases, they rely on diesel to produce their electricity. And for these communities, they really see hydrogen as an opportunity to get off of diesel generated electricity and have a clean fuel provide their electricity source. For producing hydrogen within the province, another thing that we have to our advantage is that we possess the resources for green, blue, and turquoise hydrogen production. Given all that, the strategy does only support renewable and low carbon sources of hydrogen. So again, this might be something that most folks on the call already know, but there are multiple production pathways for hydrogen. And some of them are not low carbon, as you can see in this chart here. So the traditional form of hydrogen production, steam, methane reformation of natural gas, does have quite a bit of emissions associated with it, and is actually how most hydrogen today is produced. So the province is really moving towards the low carbon pathways, which is same thing, steam methane reformation, but with adequate carbon capture and storage, natural gas pyrolysis, electrolysis, and byproduct hydrogen all kind of fit within what we're calling low carbon hydrogen. And to kind of quantify what that definition means is we have committed within the hydrogen strategy to establish a carbon intensity threshold that will decline over time and align with our net zero targets. For using hydrogen in BC, we've identified kind of 6 key end use applications. There's of course blending into the natural gas network, using hydrogen in zero emission vehicles, whether that's fuel cell electric vehicles or hydrogen internal combustion engines, using hydrogen as a feedstock for low carbon or synthetic fuels. So lots of fuels that we use today have hydrogen as a feedstock. And as I said on the previous slide, most hydrogen is produced via the high carbon pathway now. So if you can displace that carbon and displace that hydrogen and replace it with low carbon hydrogen, then your final fuel is going to be lower carbon as well. We've also identified power generation and storage as a good opportunity for hydrogen, especially in kind of those unique cases, say in remote communities where they might be using intermittent renewables to supply some of their power and where hydrogen can be used to firm that. Also in industrial processes, so using hydrogen as a feedstock or as something to combust to achieve the high process temperatures that are required in a lot of industrial processes. And this is a great example of where we need to achieve significant decarbonization, but can't do that practically, at least through direct electrification. So hydrogen is a good opportunity there. Then the last one being export. BC is obviously very well positioned geographically to access developing markets in Asia Pacific, as well as in the US. And this has actually become a really increasing piece for us. And I think a lot of different organizations and folks operating in the hydrogen sector, probably up and down the West Coast, is how do you balance promoting export to already quite developed markets in Asia Pacific, with perhaps using that economic input to help grow your own domestic market, because you don't want to be producing hydrogen and just shipping it all away. But I think that's something that will be tackled kind of in the coming years. So in BC, we definitely see hydrogen as an opportunity to fuel clean economic development. We, since the release of the strategy, have approximately 40 hydrogen projects proposed for BC, and that represents over $4 billion of potential investment. And of course, from the provincial lens, and I think in a lot of ways this aligns with the lens that utilities have to take, is that we think British Columbians will really benefit from these clean economic opportunities across the hydrogen value chain. And a lot of that stems from the diverse and variety of ways that you can produce hydrogen, and then also how you can use hydrogen. So that means opportunities for Indigenous communities and businesses here in BC. We already started to see communities and businesses getting on board, whether that's to use hydrogen to displace diesel, like I said, for producing electricity, or just to be part of the value chain and maybe they're getting involved in an export project. Then we also see opportunities for new skilled trades and professional clean energy jobs, and of course, how that's all tied into new low carbon opportunities for the natural gas sector. Of the 40 proposed projects that we have been tracking, many cite blending into the natural gas network as one of their main offtake opportunities. And so that lines up really well with a hydrogen blending study that the province has committed $5 million to, for a total of $15 million on the study that's being led by Enbridge, Fortis, BC, and Pacific Northern Gas. And the study will look to examine the technical, economic, and regulatory requirements to introduce hydrogen into BC's natural gas network. We're starting to see more of these studies kind of pop up in different jurisdictions. And we think it's really important both for BC and Canada and other surrounding jurisdictions to learn, like, what do we actually need to do and what does hydrogen look like, both kind of in the technically feasible, but also economic and regulatory side of how we get hydrogen to be a reality. In addition to having the blending study, we have identified 4 key implementation priorities. And these cover off a lot of the short-term actions within the hydrogen strategy. Of course, as I said, we have 63 actions, and that kind of makes it easier for us to work towards to break that down a bit, but also to communicate. So the first is to establish a declining carbon intensity threshold for low carbon hydrogen production. The second is to plan and establish regional hydrogen hubs through the co-location of supply and demand. Third is identifying legislative and regulatory gaps for project development. And the last one there is to develop a CO2 storage atlas to quantify the geological storage capacity of northeastern BC. For our first implementation priority, that's implementing a declining carbon intensity threshold for low carbon hydrogen production. It's been a really interesting process to try to make this a reality. We did, kind of as we were going through drafting the BC hydrogen strategy, kind of test the waters and see what that would look like with potentially having a carbon intensity threshold implemented then, but we've moved that to a commitment to implement it in the near future. And why this is interesting is because we really have to balance achieving our future targets like net zero with economic growth, because of course we have several jurisdictions kind of in the Pacific Northwest, North America, that are also producing hydrogen, say for instance in Alberta. And while we think that there's a lot of complementary opportunities to work together across jurisdictions, of course, from the provincial perspective, we don't want to lose all the potential investment to different locations. So how do we set a carbon intensity threshold that attracts companies and projects here? We do think that the carbon intensity threshold, in addition to all of those other policies I listed earlier, actually makes BC a really attractive jurisdiction, because we've heard from potential producers that they know if they come and have a project here in BC and can get it off the ground, that they are going to be producing close to, if not the cleanest hydrogen in the world, simply because it's de facto that they have to comply with all of the policies that we have in place. And then, of course, this carbon intensity threshold will go out to 2050, and we're looking to kind of get that in place in the very near future. This here is something that I've snipped from our BC hydrogen strategy, and I'll admit that a lot of work has been being done around these different numbers and carbon intensities of different pathways, and I think that these numbers changed a bit. So I don't want to have anyone get too hung up on the numbers that are listed here, but I think it's worthwhile looking at to see how a carbon intensity threshold achieves allowing only low carbon hydrogen production without being without choosing a pathway and allowing you to be pathway agnostic, because we do have the clean electricity here. We also have the largest natural gas reserves in Canada. So we want to make sure that we're able to leverage all of the resources that we do have at our disposal. And you can see here things like SMR with CCS, very high percentages of capture will likely fit under that threshold. Pyrolysis will be there, byproduct hydrogen, and then of course electrolysis as well. The second piece of our implementation plan is to plan and establish regional hydrogen hubs. For those of you that don't know, this has become a pretty internationally accepted solution to the chicken and egg issue of what comes first, hydrogen supply or demand. Of course, suppliers are looking for demand certainty before they move forward with the project. And on the flip side, off-takers are looking for supply certainty. So if you can get those two groups to work together moving forward in kind of a regional location, then you're able to get over that issue. So in BC, we're definitely adopting this approach. And the first step will be to develop a blueprint for hydrogen development in the Vancouver region. And the purpose of that will be to identify hydrogen demand and supply, commercialization opportunities, and local assets and gaps. Digging into a couple of pieces here, the local assets and gaps portion will be both physical assets, such as where can you get enough power to have your electrolysis or pyrolysis plant? Where are the best locations to blend hydrogen into the natural gas network? And then also, really importantly, creating this blueprint with a focus on commercialization opportunities. There's kind of a variety of approaches out there with how do you plan a hub, and some really good work being done by different organizations. But what we're trying to do here in BC is to match the urgency of the climate emergency with getting projects up and going and off the ground. So we're not looking to just create another study. We want to match the blueprint with commercialization opportunities and help these projects actually start producing hydrogen, using hydrogen, and reducing emissions. And as part of that, we're really trying to scope down to where hydrogen is required to decarbonize our economy. If you were to just look at what are the hydrogen opportunities across BC, there are many and technically endless before you dig too deep. And we know that hydrogen is complementary with many other decarbonization tools like direct electrification, but we want to really make sure that we're using it where it's needed so we can achieve the deepest decarbonization possible. Still on hubs, this map is useful. We have identified 4 main locations for planning hubs to start with. Those are kind of the Vancouver region where the largest green dot is there at the bottom, up in Prince George, which is the top right green dot, the southern interior, bottom right green dot, and then also on Vancouver Island. And these hubs have been identified for a couple of different reasons when we've been analyzing their characteristics. And it's either because they have the assets and infrastructure in place or pretty much in place, and lots of project interest to kind of get that hub going sooner than later. Or alternatively, they have the potential to have those assets in place And then thirdly, another aspect is having the willing parties involved, because you could have a region that works perfectly for a hub, but if you don't have industry willing to get in and progress those projects, then it doesn't matter. And a couple of other locations that have really good potential down the line to be hydrogen hubs too is in the Southeast BC, of BC, and then also in Prince Rupert. The Port of Prince Rupert and some of the organizations that work there are really interested in decarbonizing their suite of export products. They primarily focus in fossil fuels export right now. And of course, hydrogen commodities, things like ammonia, really present a good opportunity for them to achieve that. This is a graphic that I like to show, and so folks know this is kind of the Vancouver region, to show what a hub could look like. This is very much an example. We don't have projects set up in these specific locations, but I like it for a couple of reasons, in the sense that it shows all of the different ways hydrogen could be being used across a regional economy, and also thinking about it in the sense of how hubs are probably going to look different depending on their locations, and are they more of an urban location, or are they more remote with heavy industry? And so, for example, here in Vancouver, while there's still industry that will be able to utilize hydrogen production and reduce emissions from that, you probably see less hydrogen being used in industry than you do in the Prince George hub. So something for us to acknowledge, especially with, I think, lots of governments and different organizations in different jurisdictions trying to find a definition for hydrogen hubs, and not to be too prescriptive, because I think they're going to look different depending on where they are, and taking a flexible approach, I think, will allow for the most success. Third implementation priority is to identify legislative and regulatory gaps for project development, so essentially regulatory mapping. And through this, we want to map the entire regulatory framework that covers hydrogen production, storage and transportation, and end use. And kind of what we're thinking for that is run basically proxy projects that cover all the different production pathways and the different end uses through our current regulatory framework, and see what snags they're hitting. We have already identified some gaps within our legislation. For example, the Water Sustainability Act here in BC, which would allow electrolysis producers to use water to actually produce hydrogen. So the consumptive action, that needs to be an amendment to allow that in the Water Sustainability Act. And then also in our Oil and Gas Activities Act, there's going to be amendments to make sure that we have the right regulators in place for the different parts of the hydrogen value chain. So whether that's the Oil and Gas Commission or Technical Safety BC. So those are things that we're looking to figure out. And through this mapping process, we think that we'll probably identify additional gaps and barriers in the current framework for hydrogen deployment in BC. And as a result of that, of course, we'll pursue additional amendments that need to take place. But we think there'll also be a very good opportunity to learn and leverage existing regulatory frameworks that might be in place, say, for traditional fuels, to then use that for hydrogen and not have the big changes there. The last piece.
Hayden, before you go there, I just want to get people, this is Dan Kirschner, by the way. Hi, everybody. Hi, Hayden. Thanks.
Hey.
I was on another webinar where I had to testify on a bill in committee. So thank you for your forbearance. But I just wanted to remind people, get your questions ready, enter them into the chat. I think Hayden's getting pretty close to wrapping up. So
this is the last slide.
Yeah, all right, there you go. So I'm a little late making the prompt, but if you have questions, put them in the chat there. Thanks. Sorry for the interruption, Hayden. Thank you.
No problem. Thank you. And yeah, so last piece is developing a CO2 storage atlas to quantify the geological storage capacity specifically in northeastern BC. And that's to identify and assess potentially suitable storage options in the northeast of the province. And I think it's pretty clear for most of us on the call probably, and especially anyone that works in the natural gas space, how critical CO2 storage capacity will be for the development of blue hydrogen production. In BC, we know that we have a lot of storage capacity, but part of this work will just be modernizing and getting more up-to-date data on what that will look like. There you go, as I promised. That was it, and thank you very much, everyone, for listening today. Happy to answer any questions now, or my email's there if you want to shoot me an email.
Great. Thank you very much, Hayden. I will be looking at your presentation after the fact, and it's a reminder to folks that Judy will be sending a note out to all of you indicating that the YouTube recording of this of Hayden's presentation is live. I'll come a little later this afternoon. Hayden's deck will also, he's graciously agreed to make that available to you. So I, for one, will be taking advantage of that and watching what I'm sure was a great presentation. So any questions? Well, let's see if we got if any folks are going to type any questions in. Hayden, you might have been very thorough in your presentation. So
that's why the email address is there.
Yeah. Thanks for putting that up. Hydrogen's part of ensuring we can get to achieve the decarbonization goals our region has set, both individually across jurisdictions as well as collectively. And we're excited about the opportunities that brings. Well, if you're typing in, I'll give you just a minute longer and remind people that our March webinar will be consistent with this theme. It's the American Gas Association released just last week. It's net zero for natural gas utilities, demonstrating that there are pathways available to natural gas utilities to help contribute to and achieve net zero objectives. That's our March webinar. Please sign up for that. And in April, we'll have a fascinating conversation from a couple of state associations. Our builders associations in Washington and Oregon will be joining us to discuss housing affordability in the context of energy policies that are being promulgated in our region. So another fascinating webinar that we have in store for you. So we do encourage you to go to our website and sign up for those, nwga.org. And Hayden, I don't see any questions. So I'm going to thank you for your time one last time again. Oh, wait, we just got a question.
We got one.
So where exactly do you think the hub in BC's southern interior would be located? And how would this hydrogen at this hub be generated and by whom? And what would main demand be? So where, who and how would it be used?
Great question. Thank you, Mike. Talking about the Southern Interior Hub, I think it should be classified as a location that has the potential to work well as a hydrogen hub, a little bit less so than Vancouver region or up in Prince George, where there are activities that point to hydrogen hubs being developed there already. So when we're talking about a hub in Southern Interior, that's kind of Kelowna, Kamloops region, even an opportunity, we've already heard some projects in Penticton that are looking to be involved. Forms of producing that hydrogen, that depends. What we've seen so far is green hydrogen projects being proposed. Of course, there's opportunities around there for blue hydrogen, turquoise hydrogen as well. And I think, and perhaps maybe where this question is coming from, Mike, I see you're from Fortis there, and nice to meet you, is kind of near Fortis's service zone, is getting close to that neck of the woods where Fortis is involved both on the natural gas and the electricity side. And we have also heard about projects that are getting involved with Fortis that way. And when it comes to the main demand within this hub, there are some industrial activities within the region and a little bit further away, and that's kind of the potential for an even more southeastern hub is some mining activities. But also the potential to connect the dots between all the work that's being done in Alberta 4 hydrogen production kind of hubs there, with the hubs in BC. So when we're talking about heavy duty transportation, things like that, to have a hub within the southern interior that will allow for those to be connected and essentially connect the dots from being hubs and into a network.
So I'll just note for the group that their technologies are coming out right now that are going to be very exciting. For instance, there's a firm called Stars Technology Corp in Richland, Washington, the Tri-Cities. It's a hydrogen technology firm that's made up of people who've retired from PNNL down there, Pacific Northwest National Lab. And they have developed a chemical hydrogen conversion process that can deliver and is starting to deliver blue hydrogen on the gas pipeline system. So it's not an electrolytic process, it's a chemical reaction process. If anybody's interested, go check out Stars H2. Stars H2. I don't get paid to promote them, but I'm excited about the technology, and there's a lot of others. Obviously, they're working. This particular group is working to do a proof of scale, really, in Southern California. So with SoCal Gas. So that just that's another to Mike's question. Where do you produce hydrogen and how? In the southern interior of BC, for instance, or other places that may not be immediately adjacent to significant solar or wind installations. There is a coming technology that I think is going to allow us to produce at least blue hydrogen, if not a renewable hydrogen, off of the pipeline grid.
That
exciting.
That is really exciting. I'm definitely going to check that out. I also want to note, in relation to your question, Mike, and also kind of to build off of your comment, Dan, is an interesting consideration in BC when we're thinking about the production pathways from natural gas, is we have the situation where our storage capacity is in the Northeast and our demand centers are typically in the Southwest. So that creates a problem, not, I don't think, an insurmountable problem, but where are you doing that conversion and production of hydrogen? Is it in the Northeast? Because if it is, then you need to transport it to the Southwest. And if you're producing the Southwest, then you need to transport the carbon up north. So that's, I think, where when you're looking at the future of hydrogen from natural gas, something like pyrolysis technologies is really exciting, because then the carbon is just so much easier to manage in its solid form.
Yeah, we do have another question here, Hayden, and it's, will hydrogen removal technology be considered or utilized at hydrogen hubs from a blended stream in parentheses?
Is that to ask, and Dan, you might be able to clarify for me, in the sense of if you already had hydrogen blended in the network and you're looking to then pull it out for specific hydrogen uses?
Well, I'm going to say yes. I think that's where we're going, but I'm also going to invite Matt to come off mute if I'm wrong.
Correct. Yes. Okay,
great. There you go. So you
Sure.
blended it in. How do you pull it off?
From a blended stream, and if you wanted to utilize that hydrogen for a pure hydrogen purpose for fuel cell vehicles or what have you, and or if there's an interconnected facility that has issues for on hydrogen tolerance for blended stream.
Great question. Thank you, Matt. And I think my answer will be, could be, likely will be down the line. But initially, when we're developing hydrogen hubs and what we're seeing so far and working with utilities and industry, and kind of the idea, at least in BC, like, we don't have any hydrogen production of any meaningful scale to talk about. So we're starting to kind of say, okay, let's just take these baby steps. First off, we're probably going to be seeing hydrogen production that's very close to demand, and it's just used directly as hydrogen. But how this ties into a couple of comments that I made earlier, where let's say you get significant blue hydrogen production in northeastern BC, and that's not necessarily near your demand centers. One of the options is definitely to blend it into the natural gas network and then you're able to pull it out in the different, what might be hubs at the time, or maybe since this will be a couple years in the future, likely you're getting closer to a network, but you have the end uses that need pure hydrogen. And I think this is where your question was going. So you might be fully aware of how this might work, but then you can pull it out. Yeah, so I see that, and from the provincial perspective, that's kind of down the line, but great question. I think it's something that is being considered, and we do hear of projects like that, but I also don't want to speak too much for some of BC's really great folks that work at utilities that are looking into that.
All right, great. I don't see any other questions in the chat. So those are a couple good ones to close the webinar on. And Hayden, virtual applause. I'm hearing it from everybody who's on mute. Thank you for your time today and for a terrific presentation. Again, Judy will send a link out for the YouTube recording that you can forward around if you like. And Hayden has also made clear that we can share his deck with you. So take advantage of that. And with that, I will look forward to seeing you all. I think it's March 21st is our next webinar. And look forward to seeing you then. Thanks again, everybody. Have a great day.
Thank you.